This lecture will be recorded for those who could not join us today. Again, this is part one of the reproductive system. We are going to start with the male reproductive anatomy. So this is an overview of the male reproductive anatomy. Keep in mind that when we talk about the reproductive system, it's essentially a two-in-one, right? Because there is a male version and a female version. I highly recommend that we are familiar with the differences and also the similarities, because you will be able to eliminate some multiple choice options, because the questions asking about the male anatomy and some of the multiple choice options only pertain to the female anatomy. So, basic terminology. First, the gonads. These are the reproductive organs. Gonads are a general term. So in the male, the gonads are the testes. In the female, the gonads are the ovaries. There are two of each in the male, and two testes for the male, two ovaries for the female. The gonads are responsible for making the reproductive cells, which we term the gametes. So the gametes are the product of meiosis, which is different from mitosis. The gametes will have a haploid number of chromosomes. So in the human species, there are 46 chromosomes in total. So a gamete should only have 23 chromosomes, because sperm must meet egg to make a total of 46. That's essentially what you see in conception. When that happens, you formally make a zygote. One of the most challenging things about reproductive anatomy and physiology is there's many terms to denote different stages of reproductive cell division. And so generally, we refer to the immature egg as the oocyte. You'll see the term ovum a lot. Technically, the oocyte becomes an ovum when there is a sperm worthy enough to fertilize said egg. In the male reproductive anatomy, the testes are going to be the site of sperm production. When sperm is produced, it is stored temporarily in the epididymis until the event of ejaculation. During ejaculation, there is a tube called the vas deferens. It's also referred to as the Ductus deferens. Both mean the exact same thing. So be prepared to see either or on your upcoming celebration of learning. This tube connects the testes to the urethra. And recall that for the male urethra, not only is it longer than the female urethra, the male urethra also carries two types of bodily fluid: urine, of course, and then sperm in the form of semen. There are several accessory glands we'll talk about, one of which is the seminal vesicle, which is the first gland that will contribute to ejaculate fluid. More on that in, I believe, the second slide set. We've already talked about how the urethra in the male anatomy has two different functions. Here is the overview of the female anatomy. So two differences right off the bat. The female anatomy has a uterus with a vaginal tract to connect the uterus to the outside world. And then instead of testes, which are found below the pelvic cavity, the ovaries are found within the pelvic cavity. And that will explain why males are more prone to a condition known as an inguinal hernia. So the ovary is going to be the site of oocyte or egg maturation, gamete production. There is a fallopian tube, also known as the uterine tube, also known as the oviducts. I don't know why there are so many names, but you are responsible for all of them. So again, fallopian tube is the same as uterine tube, is the same as oviduct. This tube is responsible for carrying that egg that's released during ovulation to the uterus for possible implantation should there be fertilization along the way. The most inferior aspect of the uterus is the cervix right here. There is a central opening called the os. This opening of the cervix is what will allow menstrual fluid to pass because you're shedding the innermost lining of the uterus because there is no pregnancy to support. That ideally happens every 28 days. The other structure, if you can call it that, that exits through the cervix would be after 9 months of pregnancy, and that would be baby. Now, the cervix is also the entrance for which sperm would have to pass through to get into the uterus and into the fallopian tube for possible conception, for possible fertilization. So the testes, the male gonads, will produce about 500 million sperm per day. The testes are always in motion, always producing sperm. The ovaries, not quite the case. They will release one oocyte per month. Both gonads, ovaries and testes, are also responsible for making the sex hormones. So testes are primarily responsible for making testosterone, and the ovaries are responsible for making estrogen and progesterone, which are supposed to cycle. Ideally, in some synchrony, this was what allows a woman of childbearing age to have a menstrual cycle. When it comes to fertility treatments, there is a difference between emission and ejaculation, both of which, not both of which, I'll start with emission. Emission is the process by which mature sperm, and we know that we're looking at mature sperm because this sperm under a microscope will have a head and a tail. Emission is the process by which mature sperm moves along the duct system. So this refers to the duct in question is the Ductus deferens, also known as the vas deferens. The semen is a product of sperm mixed with the secretions that are coming from the 3 accessory glands of the male reproductive system. They are the seminal vesicle, prostate, and bulbourethral glands. We will talk more about at the beginning of the next slide sets. Now, ejaculation is the process by which semen is expelled from the body through the urethra. So emission only really occurs in the ductus deferens. Ejaculation only really occurs in the male urethra. Here's an overview of the functions of the male reproductive system, which is a helpful reference slide. It will also tell you the order of events that need to occur in order for semen to be released. So the default state in development is the female state. And what I mean by that is as soon as conception or fertilization occurs, the development proceeds as if the baby is going to be female. And then if there is a Y chromosome present, then at about between the 6 to 8 week mark from conception, it starts to initiate a series of processes that convert essentially the ovary to a testy. And like I mentioned before, one of the main differences between the male and female anatomy is that the male gonads are found inferior to the pelvic cavity, whereas the female gonads are found within the pelvic cavity. So at some point, the testes have to descend to reach the inferior aspect of the pelvic cavity. And this is occurring throughout pregnancy. And so by birth, they should descend. And it's one of the physical exam tests that pediatrics will perform on a newborn male. As the testes descend, the male also forms a spermatic cord. There are key contents that are found in the spermatic cord, one of which is the ductus deferens. The ductus deferens is part of the spermatic cord. Also, the testicular artery, which is a direct branch of the abdominal aorta. There is a right testicular artery to feed the right testy, and there's a left testicular artery to feed the left testy. There's also nerves that pass through the spermatic cord, as well as a vein. And the vein looks somewhat different here. It looks like a network of vessels. This is a region of the testicular vein known as the pampiniform plexus. In blue, right here, it is part of the spermatic cord. Now, the spermatic cord penetrates a sheath of connective tissue called in the inguinal region, and where it penetrates this connective tissue is known as the inguinal canal. It is a source. It is an area of weakness in the inguinal region of the male anatomy, and because of this, males are more prone to inguinal hernia. In an inguinal hernia, parts of the digestive tract, specifically the intestines, have been pushed through this inguinal canal here because it is an area of weakness in the male anatomy. And so the reason for why males are more prone to inguinal hernias is because there's a spermatic cord that needs to penetrate the inguinal canal. Female anatomy does not have this at all. This brings us to the scrotum. So the scrotum has two chambers. It is separated by a skin fold right here, known as the raphe. There are two muscles involved, one of which is the dartos muscle. The dartos muscle is found, a smooth muscle found in the scrotal sac, which is comprised of skin. The smooth muscle is what will elevate the testes to help make sure the testes are always in an optimal temperature in order to support spermatogenesis. The cremaster muscle is right here surrounding the testes. It's not part of the scrotal sac. It is closer to the testes. It will tense the scrotum to help pull the testes closer to the body. So in the cremaster reflex, when the inner thigh is stroked, it will cause the scrotum almost immediately to move the testes closer to the body. Normal sperm development will occur at a certain temperature, and the dartos and cremaster muscles together help make sure the testes are, as much as possible, in this temperature so that spermatogenesis is not compromised. In the testes, there are many tightly coiled tubes called the seminiferous tubules. This is the site of sperm production. We'll talk more about in just a few slides. Now, this is a histology slide of the testes. Here's a seminiferous tubule. Here's a seminiferous tubule. What you're seeing here and here surrounding the lumen of the seminiferous tubule are immature sperm cells trying to go through spermatogenesis. The more mature they become, the closer they are to the lumen, because once they are matured, they have to travel through the lumen of the seminiferous tubules to the epididymis, where they will be stored until it is time for emission and ejaculation. So there are different types of cells in the testes. There are these nurse Sertoli cells within the seminiferous tubules. We'll see more of them later on. What you see on this slide are the cells of Leydig. Cells of Leydig are outside the seminiferous tubules. Outside the seminiferous tubules, they're also known as the interstitial cells, appropriately named based on where they are, right, in the testes. The cells of Leydig, the interstitial cells, are the primary site of testosterone production in the male. Now, the other place that males will have testosterone production is in that zona reticularis of the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland. Most testosterone in the male is made in the interstitial cells, the cells of Leydig. So what happens in spermatogenesis? Spermatogenesis is the process by which the precursor for sperm matures into sperm that is ready for fertilization. So here are all these immature sperm going through the process, going through the process, going through the process. I really like this slide a lot because it highlights for you the steps in spermatogenesis. Okay, so I want to highlight for you the nurse cells. They are found in the they're dispersed within these seminiferous tubules. You have to be within the seminiferous tubules to be a nurse cell. The nurse cell helps provide support to the surrounding cells as surrounding spermatogonium as they are going through the process of spermatogenesis. So how this goes is spermatogonium become primary spermatocytes. That brings them to the end of meiosis 1. And then when they go through meiosis 2, they're a secondary spermatocyte. At the end of meiosis 2, they become a spermatid. And then after they are a spermatid, they still need a neck and tail to become mature sperm. So you're not mature sperm until you have a neck and tail. The reason why is because they're going to need that neck and tail to traverse the female reproductive system, essentially, to make sure they can get to the fallopian tube where it may possibly see an oocyte or an egg to fertilize. So here's that number 23 again, number 23, number 23, number 23. There's a ratio of 4:1, so potentially 4 mature sperm, each with a haploid number of chromosomes that are made from each spermatogonia, each stem cell found in the seminiferous tubule. While spermiogenesis focuses on physical maturation into sperm, so sperm is actually the nickname, the long name for sperm is spermatozoon, just so you know. As sperm mature, they will less likely be attached to that supporting nurse cell. It's also known as a Sertoli cell. In spermiation, the sperm is deemed mature enough to go forth into the lumen of the seminiferous tubule and enter the epididymis for storage. That process of sperm leaving the nurse or Sertoli cell is spermiation. This entire process takes about 9 weeks, and it is all it overlaps. Okay, so again, males are always producing sperm. So let's talk about the hormones that regulate nurse Sertoli cells. The big one here is follicle stimulating hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone was one of the hormones that is produced and released by the anterior pituitary gland we talked about earlier this semester. The anterior pituitary gland is also known as the adenohypophysis, just as a reminder. Follicle stimulating hormone will travel through the bloodstream to access the nurse Sertoli cells and increase sperm production and maturation. The nurse Sertoli cells will also release inhibin, which is going to be really important for negative feedback mechanism. Inhibin will go back to the anterior pituitary gland and say, hey, we've got ample sperm production. We can take a break for just a little bit so that the testes is never overloaded with sperm, if you will. Now the Blood-Testis Barrier. So this is found in the seminiferous tubule. It is created by the nurse cells and the tight junctions of the seminiferous tubule right here. This is really important for making sure that there is no autoimmune process occurring at the testes, because that would definitely be bad news. The reason why this is important is because, without getting too much into detail, because I don't have time, unfortunately, is in the process of sperm production, there are also sperm-specific antigens that are produced. And those antigens can possibly be attacked by certain immune cells. So the nurse cells, Sertoli cells, and tight junctions form this blood-testis barrier so that the immune cells don't have the opportunity to recognize that there is an antigen on sperm, which would, if so, this would inhibit and compromise sperm production, which could certainly trigger some issues with fertility in the male. The only thing that is new on this slide is androgen binding protein. In bold for you, it is abbreviated ABP. This, when present, will elevate testosterone in the seminiferous tubules. It does this by making testosterone less lipophilic. Recall that testosterone is one of the sex hormones. It is, and the sex hormones are based on cholesterol, which is a very lipophilic. It's lipid based, right? And so in order to help testosterone enter the seminiferous tubule, androgen binding protein will make testosterone less lipophilic so that it can traverse into the seminiferous tubules a little bit easier. The nurse cells, also known as Sertoli cells, are also responsible for releasing Mullerian inhibiting factor. It's also known as Mullerian inhibiting substance, MIS. This is going to be really important during that key week during development, where the embryo, the developing fetus, becomes, it's that time during development where processes may start. If there is a Y chromosome, that would thereby convert the ovaries to testes, or if there is no Y chromosome, the genetic makeup of these sex chromosomes are XX, it will stay female. So this determination happens at about 6 to 8 weeks after fertilization, which is also known as conception. So I mentioned earlier that the default state is the female state. So the development occurs as if the baby is going to be female. And then between weeks 6 to 8, the presence of the Y chromosome is going to change the position of 2 types of ducts. So you've got the Wolffian duct, also known as the mesonephric duct. It is pictured for you here on this slide. There are also Mullerian ducts, also known as paramesonephric ducts. So in blue is the Wolffian duct. In red is the Mullerian duct. Now, as we follow along, what helps here is there's kind of a color coding system going on here. So Wolffian duct is color coded blue to represent that it's going to be what will be found in the male anatomy, whereas the Mullerian duct is what will be found in the female anatomy. So let's go back to this whole concept of Mullerian inhibiting factor. If in the presence of Y chromosome, this will essentially activate the production of nurse cells, these Sertoli cells. The female anatomy does not have nurse cells. And so by the very presence of nurse cells between weeks 6 to 8 of development, they are responsible for secreting Mullerian inhibiting factor. And Mullerian inhibiting factor is what will inhibit the further development of these Mullerian ducts in what will become a male baby, because they won't need it. they're supposed to be male. You only see Mullerian ducts in the female anatomy. So if the Y chromosome is present, then that will trigger the production of nerve cells, which will then trigger the production and secretion of a Mullerian inhibiting hormone, which will then cause the Mullerian duct to degenerate so that it is no longer present in the male anatomy. Stop the recording or pause the recording right. Okay, so now we're talking about sperm maturation. So because some of the work that I do is infertility, so helping couples who are having difficulty conceiving, finally conceive, interestingly enough, typically it's the female that comes in first, right? Because they cannot get a positive pregnancy test. Why? Well, by the time they come for the second appointment, I make sure they bring their partner because I don't know if you know this, but it takes two to make this work, right? So it may not necessarily be just a female issue. And one of the things that we look at in the male is what is the quality of sperm production? Sometimes what we see is maybe they make a lot of sperm, but they don't have a head or a tail. And that would obviously be a problem, right? Because without a head where there's lots of mitochondria, the mitochondria is needed to make lots of ATP to power this tail. Without that tail, it will not make it. It will not make it in the female anatomy. So we can look at, I believe in lab, you saw histology slides of sperm. What's even more interesting and fun to see is under a microscope, we look at how motile, how movable the sperm are. Sometimes we see mature sperm. We say this because it's got a head, neck, and tail, but they're not moving, or they're not moving very much. And that would obviously be a problem. It's going to be hard for any sperm to enter the fallopian tube for possible conception. So there is nothing new to add based on this slide. There are 3 sections to the epididymis you should have talked about in lab. The head is always the part that is connected to the seminiferous tubules within the testes. The tail is the part of the epididymis, the last piece, before mature sperm actually enters the ductus deferens in the process we defined as emission. So the ductus deferens, the vas deferens, many students are surprised at the trajectory it takes. So it rises with the spermatic cord, it rises over and behind the urinary bladder. It rises over and behind the urinary bladder. And the reason why that's important is because it's got to pass by several of the accessory glands that will facilitate sperm when it makes it into the female reproductive system. So behind the urinary bladder, there is an ejaculatory duct that will deposit this sperm into the urethra during ejaculation. As this sperm makes it to the urethra, it passes through the 3 accessory glands we've mentioned already. We'll talk more about in the next PowerPoint slide set. All of this movement through the ductus deferens is mediated by smooth muscle. And hopefully you're seeing a theme now, because we saw this with the ureter. We saw this with the tube that is the digestive system. The esophagus is a good example. Anytime you see smooth muscle working to move contents along a tube, you will definitely see peristaltic contractions, aka peristalsis. So the ejaculatory duct is this section right here. It deposits, makes sure sperm enters the urethra. By the time sperm passes through the ejaculatory duct, it has received secretions from the seminal glands, also known as the seminal vesicles. The seminal vesicles are responsible for 60% of what is ejaculate fluid, mainly alkaline, and it's got to be alkaline because the vagina is primarily acidic, and so that alkaline, it's helpful for sperm to come in with alkaline with an alkaline as an alkaline substance, so that there's some neutralization that can occur, so that it can stand some sort of a chance in that acidic vaginal tract. Are there any questions on that part one or that first set of PowerPoint slides? All right, let's talk more about the accessory glands for the male reproductive system. So seminal vesicles, prostate gland, and bulbourethral glands. They are located in this order. From superior to inferior. The prostate gland is probably the easiest to find because it's located just underneath, just inferior to the urinary bladder. So generally, the reason why the male anatomy has accessory glands is to provide the sperm what it needs to withstand the treacherous environment that is the female reproductive system. So what do I mean by that exactly? Well, here is an excellent summary slide of what the accessory glands provide. Most of the seminal vesicles provide has the most contribution. That's worth knowing. It is supported by the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral glands has some contribution. Please note that you will also see bulbourethral glands in the female reproductive system. It's just located in a different position. You'll see later on. With that being said, seminal vesicles and prostate gland are a male-specific accessory gland. One more time, seminal vesicles and the prostate gland are a male-specific accessory gland. So the seminal vesicles are slightly alkaline. It will contain fructose, which is easily metabolized by sperm. It's essentially food for sperm, right? So like even though the neck has lots of mitochondria, some things got to feed the mitochondria. And if you think about what's necessary for what feeds the mitochondria, there's got to be a precursor that comes from a carbohydrate precursor. Fructose is that carbohydrate precursor, so that it can make the mitochondria in the neck of a mature sperm can make lots and lots of ATP to fuel that tail. Seminal vesicles will also have prostaglandins. This will initiate smooth muscle contractions in the male and female reproductive tracts to facilitate movement of sperm in these tracts. Fibrinogen is also present in seminal vesicles to form what we call a temporary semen clot. This is important because after ejaculation into the female anatomy, it is very helpful for the semen to stay together because if they start dispersing right away, it can get lost to the different parts of the female reproductive system. So that fibrinogen present that's contributed by seminal vesicles helps the semen stay together so that it increases the chance by which sperm can actually traverse through superiorly in the vaginal tract and pass that cervix. The prostate gland is responsible for A slightly acidic, it's not more than the alkaline solution that the seminal vesicles provide. Keep in mind that the bulbourethral glands also produce a slightly alkaline solution. So overall, semen or ejaculate fluid is going to be alkaline in nature. The prostate gland will have seminal plasmin. This is a protein with antibiotic qualities. This is what will help decrease UTIs in the male anatomy, which also explains why, other than sheer anatomy, and when we consider the female reproductive system and how close the urethra is to the rectum when compared to the male urethra to the male rectum. The prostate gland makes seminal plasmin, which confers some protection against UTI for the male. Prostate gland will also make prostatic acid phosphatase, abbreviated PAP. This we don't know so much about what it does for semen. What we think it does so far is it helps liquefy the semen so that it's not too thick of a substance. I will say that it's been of old use for forensic scientists, because this is actually the fluid that they look for when they're analyzing cases that were rape was suspected. In any case, let's move on to the bulbourethral glands. Slightly alkaline secretion. Its main purpose is to lubricate the gland's penis in preparation for sexual intercourse. So there's nothing new on these slides. We've talked about all these already. I'm going to move on to semen volume and sperm count. Some really cool facts here. I'm not going to require that you memorize these. Just helps for pragmatic purposes, I suppose. Now let's move on to the male external genitalia. So the penile organ is a tubular organ. It is exterior to the rest of the male anatomy. Now, the most distal end of the penile organ is the glans penis. There is skin. It's called the prepuce. It's also colloquially known as the foreskin that covers it. The reason why is because the glans penis is very, there's lots of nerve endings there. And so the prepuce, the foreskin, helps protect those nerve endings. Because circumcision is a rather popular procedure that many parents are opting for their newborn males, it's worth talking about so you can understand what's going on in circumcision. Circumcision is merely the procedure by which we remove the foreskin, and studies have shown over and over and over again that it is strongly correlated with decreased risk of infection, specifically STIs in the male. For this reason, it is a common question that is asked of new parents when they have a baby boy. The penile organ is comprised of two types of tissue, Corpora Cavernosa and the Corpus Spongiosum. Because there are two cavernosa tissue, corpora is plural for corpus. So it's often referred to as the Corpora Cavernosa. The Corpora Cavernosa is the erectile tissue. This was what will change in orientation during the event of erection. Different from the corpus spongiosum, mainly because the corpus spongiosum is where you'll find the male urethra passing through. So the male urethra will only pass through the corpus spongiosum, not the corpora cavernosa. The male urethra is longer than the female, and for that reason, it has three sections, three regions from superior to inferior. They were the prostatic urethra, you'll know because the prostate will be around it, and then the membranous urethra, and then the longest section of the male urethra is the penile urethra. It's also known as the spongy urethra because it passes through the Corpus Spongiosum. Now, in the resting state, we're going to talk about blood flow through the penile organ to help us understand what happens during the event of erection. So, in the resting state, the arterial branches, please understand that the Corpora Cavernosa is, and Corpus Spongiosum for that matter, there's lots of blood vessels in this tissue. In the resting state, the arterial branches are constricted, so there's not a lot of blood flow there. During the event of erection, blood will fill this erectile tissue so that those arterial branches will start to dilate to allow for blood to perfuse through the area, thereby resulting in stiffening of the penile organ to produce an erection. Now, there's parasympathetic activity. This is a division of the autonomic nervous system that drives this type of blood flow. This is caused by nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator, so it will widen the arteries that were previously constricted, thereby allowing for blood to pass through, thereby resulting in erection. So if you think about I was going to go on a tangent, but I don't have time for that. So we'll just keep moving right along here. So here is a closer picture of all the vessels that perfuse this erectile tissue. It's nothing that I need to add here. When it comes to understanding hormones that mediate male reproductive function, this is a very, very, very good overview. And this is where we'll end off today because it brings back concepts we learned about earlier this semester when we talked about the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus is the grandparent gland. It releases GnRH, which stands for gonadotropic releasing hormone. The gonadotropic releasing hormone will travel through the hypophyseal portal system that you find at the infundibulum. The infundibulum is the stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Recall the pituitary gland is a 2-in-1. The anterior side makes, stores, and secretes its own hormones, two of which are luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. The luteinizing hormone will travel through the bloodstream to the interstitial cells, which we've talked about today. They're also known as the Leydig cells. This is found outside the seminiferous tubules. This will trigger the production and release of testosterone. This pathway explains why testosterone is the main male hormone. FSH does something different. FSH also will travel through the bloodstream. It's got to because it's a hormone. It's part of the endocrine system. We've talked about that already. It will then act on the nurse cells. We've also referred to them as the Sertoli cells, and here you'll find a different name for them. They're all the same cell, the sustentacular cells. This will trigger the maturation, the production and maturation of sperm. It is also what will produce and secrete inhibin, and inhibin will go back to the anterior pituitary gland and say, hey, we've got enough in order to keep negative feedback systems alive when it comes to the male reproductive anatomy. Are there any questions about any of the concepts we talked about today? Wonderful. Well, if there aren't any other questions,